Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a minute. We have a big crowd, so just waiting for everybody to come in from the waiting room. All right, Nick, you want to go ahead and get things started?
Absolutely. Thank you, Maggie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nick Sargent, president of SIA. Today, we have a great panel lined up to talk about taking an inclusive approach to hiring and retaining employees. We all have an obligation to create a more welcoming and inclusive winter outdoor community, but there's also a strong business imperative as well. The question is, how do we move forward holistically with authenticity and intentionality? Today's session will focus on the importance of diversity and how different perspectives, experiences, and skill sets foster greater creativity and innovation. We'll also hear some best practices from hiring and retaining employees and how to better align and ally with employees from underrepresented groups. But before I turn this over, I want to remind you all that as SIA members, you have access to our new Inclusive Leadership Playbook, available in the member portal, a great resource for everyone looking to create positive change. So with that, I want to offer a special thanks to our moderator, Lynanne Kunkel, Chief Human Resource Officer at Vail Resorts. She has joined us on panels in the past and has graciously agreed to come back and host this conversation. So Lynanne, thank you so much for your time. I'm also pleased to welcome today's panelists, Anthony Cobb, Head of HR Global Apparel for Nike, Marc Fields, Vice President Human Resources for Vail Resorts, and Cynthia Soledad, Co-Lead Global Diversity and Inclusion Consultant, Chief Marketing Officer and Consumer Practice for Egon Zehnder. So the town hall is going to be a conversation between our panelists, like you have all seen in the past. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A tool, but I'm going to mind you, we have a lot of people today, so we may or may not be able to get to these questions and answers, but we'll try our best. We're also going to try to answer them as the panel is speaking to, so pay attention. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Lynanne to kick things off.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. I'm very excited to be able to engage with three of some of the people that I just admire the most. I have worked with every one of these individuals at some point in time in my life. And so when we had the opportunity to talk about this important topic, I reached out to each one of them because I believe that they have experiences and insights that will be beneficial to everyone that's on the call today. So we're going to introduce ourselves and then we'll get started. My hope is that by the end of this hour, you take away one or two nuggets that allow you to think about what you can do based on where your organization is on the journey, what you can do to be able to make meaningful forward progress. That's the goal. Day by day, we just keep taking incremental steps forward. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll introduce myself first, and then we'll go around. We'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves. And what I'm going to ask each panelist to share is not only their name and what they do today, but a little bit about their professional background so you understand where all of this great perspective comes from. And then I'm going to ask everybody to answer one question, which is, where does their passion for DEI come from? So I'll start. I'm Lynanne Kunkel. I am currently the Chief Human Resources Officer for Vail Resorts. I've been with Vail Resorts for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was at Whirlpool Corporation in Michigan for about 8 years. And then prior to that, I was with Procter & Gamble for almost 20 years. So a long history of working in different types of companies, different types of business models. And for me personally, my passion for DEI really comes from my early career experience with P&G. P&G was definitely an early adopter on this topic, and really trying to, in the late 80s and maybe even before that, really push the envelope on what does it mean to really reach the world's consumers, and what is the role of the employee base, the inside of the company, in reflecting the world's consumers in order to be able to ideate and design products that are going to meet a wide variety of consumer needs. And so from my early days in the late 80s, when I started there, I started in an organization that had a wide variety of people and backgrounds. And so for me, my early days of DEI was an immersive experience where I got the benefit of being able to learn about some of these topics that we're exploring experientially. And so that really shaped my views on it. It shaped my perspective on what it should look like, what it can look like. And then certainly I've learned throughout the last 30 plus years, I've learned different methods and techniques and models and tools. And so that's where my passion on this topic comes from. So with that, let me go around the horn here. Cynthia, we'll start with you. Please introduce yourself and do the same.
Sounds great. So thank you, Lynanne, and everyone for inviting us to this panel. I'll kind of intertwine my introduction and background with what brought me into DEI work and my passion for the work. So today I'm the co-lead for our global diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. And I've been here with the firm, with Egon Zehnder, for about 5.5 years now. I made a career change to join Egon Zehnder. I used to be a consumer marketer, which is the first way that Lynanne and I interacted. I was a marketer at Procter & Gamble and then at Whirlpool Corporation. And I will say that a lot of the foundational elements that you described, Lynanne, are the same foundational elements for me, starting my career as a marketer at P&G, really immersing in the craft, frankly, of listening to the broad range of consumer needs and designing products and services to meet them. In addition, at the time I was at P&G, I got really involved in employee resource groups. I identify as Asian American Pacific Islander, and I was a part of Asian American ERG there, and transitioned a lot of that passion for understanding consumers' broad needs, as well as understanding how we create a really welcoming experience in the workforce and in the organization when I moved to Whirlpool Corporation. What really prompted the transition to the role I have today, which has different pieces to it, along with my co-lead, we actually together serve as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for our firm. So today I have the chance to be a practitioner of this work and looking at the diversity of our workforce and the inclusiveness of our culture, and we're on a journey like everyone else. And I also work with clients in the space. So I've built a wonderful network of HR and Chief Diversity Officer talent. And through all of that, both, the work I do with that network of folks when I do external facing client engagements in DEI and our internal facing work, I've shifted into a space where what was earlier kind of a passion and an interest has become a real practice. Now I have an appreciation and a better understanding for the ways in which we can address systems and legacy systems and processes in the way we think about leadership and talent to create that more diverse workforce and inclusive culture. So that kind of rounds out my experiences, background, and why I do this work. And I'm so pleased to be here to talk about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Cynthia. Appreciate it. Anthony.
Hello, everybody. Anthony Cobb. I am right now the head of HR for our global apparel business in Nike. And I've sat here, and it's like really the cool place for me to hang out. I pride myself as a fashion guy, so I get to sit next to the folks who create our amazing product. Hopefully we've got some fans on this call, but it is truly an honor to be on this panel today. I've been with Nike for about 2 years. I started off in organization effectiveness. And for the majority of my career, I have practiced either in the OE space or in the talent management space. And it's been really refreshing to sit in an HRBP chair because it brings to life the total picture and having the accountability, not just of the org design and the talent placement. It really brings a different view on how we have to approach DE&I. And so I continue to push the envelope here at Nike. We, of course, are seen oftentimes as early adopters or even provocateurs in the space of different types of brand or ad campaigns. And it's truly refreshing to be on the inside and say, we want to create the parity on the inside of the organization that matches the consumer experience. My journey of DE&I probably started on my grandmother's knee as a young child, as she told me stories about her late father, Frank Cunningham Sr. She called him Papa. Papa was a man who had only third grade education, and in the Deep South had come across a point in his life where he had to confront inequity. It was the time of year where they were going to be harvesting crops. And the white folks in his town said, I'm going to make sure that your kids are available to help us harvest the crops while their children went to school. And Papa, being the person of indignation that he is or was, I carry that sometimes. My grandmother, when she finds me being stubborn, says, you're acting like Papa. So it's probably a little bit genetic as well. He said, if your kids go to school, my kids go to school. And he left Uncle on the Mississippi that night walking because he was going to be lynched. And for me, it was not just a story of indignation, but equity. And I believe that everybody deserves an equitable experience. And so I've carried that with me for the entirety of my life and now into my career, such that if we're going to create opportunities for one classification of the workforce, we need to create that for every classification across our workforce. And that's hard at times because you have to confront systems. You have to deal with people that are oftentimes inflexible or caught up in their own mental models. And I love nothing more to be in those rooms, to bring Papa to life and push the envelope so that we create equitable experiences for all of our employees. Truly is an honor to be here. Thanks for the time, and I'm looking forward to learn from this panel as much as I can give.
Thank you, Anthony. And Marc.
Hello, everyone. Before I get started my introduction, I want to say, Anthony, own your story. Your story is your superpower. And I love to hear stories like that start off sounding like they might be a detriment, but somewhere in there is a strength. And that's great to see you pull that through. I'm Marc Fields. I'm HRBP for Vail Resorts corporate functions and our hospitality and retail rental business. I also provide leadership for our DEI strategy. And I joined the company back in December 2020. I've been there for about 5 months. My background, it's a bit of a tale of two cities. I started off with finance. So early career, worked in healthcare company as an underwriter and also a health welfare consultant for Arthur Anderson, if you remember that name from a long ago. After graduate school, I switched from finance to HR. And I've been with companies in the aerospace industry, in the biotech industry, and now I'm in the sports and leisure. And I have to say, being here at Vail Resorts is an amazing experience. You know, I tell people that I had to reorient myself to what a product is. Once upon a time, it was a pallet in a warehouse, you know, that was going in the back of a truck. Now our product is what people feel when they're on our mountains. And it's an amazing transition. Really, really enjoy that. My passion for DEI, you know, honestly, my passion for DEI comes from my lived experience. First off, as a Black man in corporate America, I felt the lift and the encouragement when my differences are honored and leveraged, when I'm allowed to bring my full self to the table. There's nothing more encouraging, nothing more powerful. But I've also felt the sting from microaggressions and bias and how I had to contort myself or self-censor. My goal is to make the former everyone's reality and to make the latter go away. But what I also I learned about DEI growing up as a child in Europe. My father was in the army, so I was raised in Germany and Belgium. And there, my race was secondary to my nationality. I had more problems being an American than being Black in Europe. And so what I learned early, although I couldn't really put in these words, that people react more out of fear from your difference, more so than your race or your gender or your sexual orientation. It's just that and that causes us stress, that causes us concern. And that's what people react to. And I can only, I can't think of anything more noble to do with my life, with my career, than to help people see past their bias and to learn to value their difference and the difference of others.
Thank you, Marc. I appreciate that. And so hopefully all of the participants today see how awesome this panel is, not just as professionals who have experience in this space, but also as human beings. So I'm so proud and honored to be able to be here with all of you today. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. And just to give a brief setup before we get into some of the different questions that the panelists will take on, if we think about the past year, we as a society, really maybe as a world, we've been on this kind of collective journey together that really came out of this galvanizing event of George Floyd's murder. The reality is that because of where we all come from, we were on a common collective journey over the past year, but really from very different and unique starting points. And so we have this interesting, all of us, we have this interesting combination of our unique individual journey and our personal kind of experience and maturity in the space. And then we're all on this kind of collective journey where we're all sort of, bonded by a common event that is compelling us to come together in a new way. And so we're going to explore this a little bit where, after a year really of discussing this topic and building a lot of education and awareness broadly, many people are at a place where we're ready to go do something. And the reality is that in this desire to go do, we're trying to act from very different places of evolution, maturity, understanding, experience. And we're trying to do that often within companies that are at very different places on the maturity continuum. And so this is what we're going to try to explore all together today is how do each of us get in touch with our hunger, our desire to go do something, where we are personally in our own evolution on this topic, and how do we do that in the context of where our companies and organizations are. So that's kind of the nature of what the discussion is going to be today. And so what we're going to start with is a little bit of a chance to explore with the panelists, where have we come from? And so I'm going to start with Marc and Anthony. I'm going to ask them both the same question, but I'm going to start with Marc. Can you share a summary of where your organization, and I know you were at a different organization than Vail Resorts when George Floyd's murder took place, and of course, through your onboarding, you understand where Vail Resorts was. So please maybe answer it from both perspectives. But where was your organization on the journey at the time of George Floyd's killing? And can you describe the approach and actions of your company over the past year? And then Anthony, I'm going to ask you to do the same.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question for me because, I transitioned over the, starting the conversations late summer and transitioned in December. First I want to say that I will never forget that sitting in this very chair a year ago and trying to comport myself to turn on my camera and sit in meetings with my colleagues. And then at the end of the meeting, I would just crumble because the pain was so real. It was so visceral. And I think, where I was, everyone felt it and no one knew what to do. And we had, a pretty progressive DEI program. We had a VP DEI role. We had regional, leaders for DEI. We had programs, ERGs, all the stuff that you see at companies that have been on the journey for several years. But there was no lever or knob in any of those forums to deal with what we felt that day. I would say, a lot of companies did the same thing, right? There was this rush of memos, of condemnation, but there was variation in those memos, and there were some that felt like they had been carefully perused by PR or the functions, while others were just more raw and visceral. And honestly, what I saw happening at Vail Resorts from a distance is why I wanted to join. I think what I would say is a lot of companies reacted to the murder of George Floyd. What I wanted is someone who responded. And the difference is, what do you do once the news cycle changes, right? Do you go back to where you were, or are you forever changed? And the features that I was witnessing real time at Vail Resorts as we started the conversation told me that this is an organization that is in response mode. And an organization that realizes that, yes, this is a problem, but more importantly, that this is a system. And it's not a problem to solve, it's a system to change. And that's what we're wrestling with now. From our inclusion of the be inclusive behavior into our architecture, every employee, every leader now understands that inclusivity is a core expectation for the company. That is a response to what happened. It is embedding something that will forever change who we are, what we do, what we value. From our speaker series, where I have heard some of the most real and raw and vulnerable conversations between a CEO and an individual on a screen. We're doing things that are scary, uncomfortable, and uncommon. And we're really trying to drive this to a place to where we're not gonna go back. And so right now we're at the precipice of really putting some meaningful changes, some meaningful actions on the table. I agree, there's a lot of pent up energy out there for our employee base. As I tell everyone, before we talk about what we're going to do, we need to talk about who we're going to be, because that's what's really on the table here. Changing who we are, changing how we look at difference, changing how we look at bias, understanding what privilege really means, and demystify these things so that we can have these really important conversations around that. So that's where we are, that's what we're doing. I'm really excited to see what comes out, because this is not just important for social justice, which is critical, but it's also imperative for our business as we grow the industry as well.
Thanks, Marc. Anthony?
Yeah. So when I joined the company, I was impressed by how much was already in place. So this is November of 2018 when I came over, and we were already very mature in the employee resource group space. There was already maturity in the broad distribution of unconscious bias learning. And so I would say from an infrastructure perspective, we were in a solid space, not perfect, but in a pretty solid space around the normal, I would say, structural and program things that would be consistent with your DE&I practice. And so when George Floyd's death happened, we were able to leverage many of those existing structural kind of channels. What had probably been in advance of his death, there were a couple of global calls where our CEO was very, very provocative in talking about some specific things that he wanted to see happen within the organization, really doubling down on equity and opportunities for women and our Black employees. And in all honesty, that was a little controversial because you had other groups who felt like there was an exclusion. And he said, listen, I want to put this on your chin. There is no exclusion here. What we're calling out is for this particular moment in time, this is the data that we've received that the experience of our Black employees requires additional focus. And so because that was already underway and we were talking about these things, when George Floyd's death happened, it created space for us to say, A, we need to have just opportunities for healing and resolve, right? So the first things that we leapt into action to do, even before we made the Just Don't Do It ad about racism, was let's listen. But what was brilliant about that is it wasn't just the Black folks coming together to heal, it was a whole company healing. And so there were a number of calls that you could get on where we had clinical psychologists and those types really taking in the moment and providing those outlets for healing. And from that, we sprung into what is perceived by some to be a different strategy. I'll say we doubled down on what we've already been doing. And the power of that was that we didn't have to change course abruptly, but it caused us to really be focused on, we are a brand company all day, every day. And we have to acknowledge that if we're going to be the type of global brand that continues to have reach amongst new consumers, what are they thinking about today? And that really drives us to a comment that we use all the time, obsess the consumer, obsess the consumer. And even as late as this morning, I was listening to some foundation line plans around what are we doing across our men's apparel space. And everybody's saying, like, the athletes now are using their platforms. They're saying, I'm more than just the athlete on the field or on the court. I have a voice. I'm bringing that voice. And Nike says, let's amplify that. Let's be able to say that as core of what we stand for as a company, we're going to stand behind these athletes. So it's not uncommon for us to really have the wrestling matches internally, but we yield the Colin Kaepernick ad. We wrestle internally, but we yield the For Once Just Don't Do It ad, because we've kind of got the structural things in place. Now, let me be 100% transparent. It can be awkward and clumsy at times. We know how to show up externally, but the fact is we've really poured into putting together some of the structural things that allow us to do more instead of trying to pivot and do different. And so we have had no issues when we said we were going to give $100 million on behalf of Jordan and $40 million on behalf of Nike. We've been able to find those organizations that we've partnered with, and we're starting to celebrate that more and more because we're doubling down and doing just more of what was already programmed into our ecosystem.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Cynthia, you see obviously a lot of companies, so your perspective is going to be quite broad. I would like to hear from you. What are some of the general themes and trends that you've seen across clients and industries? And how would you sort of describe this same situation when you think about overall sentiment, focus, and progress, and how it varies across companies and industries?
Yeah, well, I love hearing both of your stories, Marc and Anthony, from your respective companies. And I'll say some of the themes that Marc and Anthony just described are things that we saw across many companies and many industries that were new in 2020. And then they exploded and went mainstream. So I'll name a couple. Marc talked about communication, outwardly, a responsive communication to what was happening in the news. Many, many companies, CEOs on down have said, I made a statement that I'm not practiced at making statements about what's happening in the news, about what's happening in politics. And in 2020, and now probably ongoing, there is a compulsion and a need and an expectation that they do so. And, you know, when we sort of sat back with a few people and reflected on that, why is that happening? And why this outpouring of response at George Floyd's murder from corporate America and corporate global, I think there was an element, many think there was an element of, we were already blurring the lines between personal and work. And historically, we'd ask people to check a lot of things at the door when they came into the office, whatever was bothering them in their personal life, including what might be happening in the news cycle, right? Including what might be happening in their communities. But if it was happening outside work, check it, and we're going to focus on work when we get here. When George Floyd was murdered, there were no lines, right? There were no boundaries. And all of a sudden you had giant populations of people saying, I can't check this at the door, right? The experience that Marc described, like I could hardly function that day. That was times, times millions. And leaders in companies had to reckon for in many cases, the first time with saying our employee population needs to hear from us on these topics because they're not able to check things at the door. And we have to acknowledge that and create a workspace where they still feel open and welcome to bring all of that here. And how do we help them, by the way, address it, right? So some of the sessions that Anthony talked about, listening sessions, town halls, bringing in psychologists, these were not common practices in 2019 and 2018, even when some very jarring events have happened, right? But all of a sudden, it wasn't just Nike and Vail Resorts. This was everywhere, and this was across all industries. And very vulnerable conversations, right? Again, blurring that line between, who we are outside of work and who we are at work. All of a sudden, the focus became, we want you to be your whole self at work, and we're going to give you space to do that. So I think these are amazing practices. They're challenging. They're challenging people to stay in some uncomfortable zones, but I think we're learning from them, right? So those are some really interesting things. And I think overall then, so you start with those seeds, like we need to listen more, we need to talk more. And then it became this explosion of like, actually, we need to be more strategic about this. So back to your question, Lynanne, on like, companies were at different places on the DEI maturity spectrum. Many of them felt compelled to respond and to listen in ways they hadn't before. But then when they sat back and said, we want to be really strategic about this, they were at different places on their strategy development. So I would say one observation that I would make is for companies that felt they were in early stages, right? Maybe, didn't even have some of the core foundational elements that, that have been described here, employee resource groups, maybe task forces, a functional leader in DEI, or leaders within HR who hold the DEI mandate. They started there. And they said, we need some people to help us determine, what do we want to look like as a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture going forward? And let's at least start there. And then what we saw with companies that were a bit more mature, like a Nike, right, on the diversity and inclusion internal front, they expanded their desire to have external impact. So the stories that Anthony described, we again saw that multiple companies. So you saw, if you think back to the news cycle, right, we saw financial service companies really doubling down on financial inclusion, right, and closing the financial wealth gaps, access to home mortgages, things like that, where there were legacy systems that were truly discriminatory, that have led to still disparities. Now you've got banks saying, we acknowledge that our industry had some poor legacy systems in the past. Now we're going to double down on improving those, and we are owning that. We have the tech industry coming out and saying, we acknowledge that there is a disparity in access to technology, by class, by race. We are going to be a part of fixing those external systems. Healthcare was already needing to grapple with that with COVID inequity, and they had to, further double down on that. So we saw it again across industries, everyone trying to find their way. If they were already working on the internal, then they were saying, what more can we do externally? And making all of those choices, internal and external, more strategic, less reactive and programmatic. That's been a big theme as well. Like maybe there were programs in place. Maybe we had somebody relatively junior in the organization who was part-time thinking about this. Now we're going to be strategic. We're going to expand our human resources against these topics. We're going to elevate the seniority of this. We're going to make it a strategic conversation.
Thanks, Cynthia. Very helpful perspective. And what strikes me about your comments is that, you know, it is kind of complex because there is this sort of innate human desire once there is awareness to want to act, and yet people are at different places in terms of what they're actually ready to act on, and the capabilities that they have to be able to act in ways that, you know, might have the appropriate level of, you know, impact or progress. And so the question that I want to open up to all of you is, as you think about, you know, 1 year later, where are you today as you think about, you know, your own mindset? You talked about where you were then. Where are you now? As you think about your own personal feelings and readiness for change, you think about that in the context of your company's readiness for change. And of course, for Anthony and Marc, we'll talk about it in the context of, you know, your companies, and then Cynthia, for you, as you see it more broadly. How does someone reconcile? How do you reconcile your own personal readiness, maybe capabilities, against the readiness of your organization and the readiness of the people within it that may be at varying levels of capability? Let's start, Anthony, let's start with you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The conversation has truly evolved, right? So before, it was probably very programmatic with the goal of creating equitable experiences for everybody. And, you know, both personally and at the organizational level, it feels like justice is far more of the word that people are looking for, right? Not just equity, but justice, right? What is just? I think that the outpouring of the consistent demonstrations on behalf of young people across the globe was, this isn't just. And so let's start to interrogate our people systems for not just equity, but for justice, right? And I really give the distinction there is, equity is like, are we showing up and having the conversations? Justice is, am I really pushing and doubling down as an advocate for this work? And so, you know, I can't count how many people reached out and was like, what's on your reading list? And I've continued, right, to say, what are you reading now? And we'll trade notes via text about, this is an amazing book, I took in this information. But it feels like that is the state of me personally and where the organization seems to go. And quite frankly, whenever you start to talk about justice, you're talking about deep-seated, centuries-old institutional practices that I believe from a capability perspective really requires us to have patience, because it's not an overnight solution. And I know many people are like, we can't keep having the repeated experience. Totally get that. But we can't have these one-off dabble do you solutions, right? It has to be much more systemic. To Cynthia's words, it has to be strategic. And as a result of it, we cannot measure DE&I improvement the same way we measure financials. This is not a year over year, a quarter over quarter. This is, am I in it for the long haul? And having a true North Star to say, if we say that justice is our new North Star, what does that mean? And how does every employee now show up to have what is an equitable and a just experience? And we've got to go and recalibrate. So it's time to not just task TA with go get me underrepresented groups or women. It is bring in total rewards, and let's have a conversation around what is the way we're doing comp? How are our incentive programs structured? Are we as an organization able to leverage equity as a means, the same way the financial institutions are talking about closing the wealth gap? What about our programs internally? So I think that we're at that place of having to look at this far more holistically than the ways we've maybe done it before, because we could get to some equity with TA. Now it's about justice. And I think that that's going to be the continued push, because I don't know if you're paying attention. The young people are like really, really demanding. And they're like, hey, hold on. If there is a misalignment between how you're showing up to the marketplace versus how we feel, we're going to call you on it, right? We will bring it, and we will tell the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that you all are jacket. So I think that there is a critical need to really lean in and say, if we're going to be the org that pursues justice, then it has to be weighed with the tolerance and temperance of time and patience. not tolerance against the rules. It's like, hey, it's not going to happen overnight. And we need people that are going to be far more in the game for the marathon versus the sprint.
Thanks. Marc.
Yeah, so I mean, framing the question, kind of where am I and how do I manage being at a different place to a certain degree with my company and my colleagues? Look, I think we've made progress, you know, and I use that word like little p, right? If I think about the arc of time, right? We have made some progress, but there's so much that still is in place. You know, when I think about where I am, I still do a calculation about my safety before I leave my home, right? As a Black man in this country, I still have concerns about how people will show up when I come into a room. And so we've made progress, but we still have our legacy issues, issues that have plagued us for over 150 years since emancipation. So, you know, I think that, yeah, because of who and what I am naturally going to be in a different place than those who don't share my background and my journey. So I've sat with that tension my entire life, my entire career. I think that what I do is I lead with grace. I understand that you cannot put yourself into my shoes, into my skin, into my reality. And so when I'm dealing with individuals who are not there or organizations that are not there, I do lead with grace, but there's always a paradox in life. There's lead with grace, and there's continue to push organizations out of their comfort zones and knowing when to flex what each one of those muscles I think is important. You know, we have now, you know, made some changes. I'm hesitant to say solutions or fixes. I think these are changes. Now there's no large debate about systemic racism. There is no large debate about the outsized violence in the Asian and the trans communities. There's no debate about the indexed impact that COVID has had on women. And while, you know, now it seems like, yeah, we know that, it's not long ago where opposing forces could drown out our voices. You know, all of those categories I just named have been shouting in the wind for years for our voices to be heard, for our challenges to be recognized, for the inequity to be addressed. And we're doing that now. So there is progress, again, little p, but we're making progress. And that gives me hope. That keeps my head in the game. That helps me deal with the puts and takes of this diversity, equity, inclusion journey that we're all on. And so when I deal with my colleagues, you know, on a daily basis, that's what I lead with, right? Let's pose some questions. Let's push the envelope. But let's keep grace at the forefront. Let's always assume positive intent. And when we have those that resist, listen for data, right? Because honestly, for me, you know, we talk about the different dimensions of diversity, but one of the most important individuals in that conversation is white men. And oftentimes, you know, we're leaving them out of the dialogue and out of the conversation, and they have a perspective that needs to be heard, it needs to be honored. And so that's something that I keep in mind too, as I check my bias, because I want my benefits. I have to listen to and look at all vectors, all dimensions, to make sure that we go on this journey together. And that's what I appreciate, honestly, about where we are at Vail Resorts, because it is a really open and dialogue is developing. We have a long way to go, I know that, but with grace and with togetherness, I think we're going to be there. It's going to be fun.
Thanks, Marc. So Cynthia, maybe you can just share your perspective on this in terms of, so how do you help your clients think about where they are on kind of the readiness continuum? And what do you do if there's readiness lags the desire? What do you do if the organization is not, maybe in a state where it can move forward in actionable ways? I'd like to hear more of your perspective on what you see and how you guide organizations through that.
I think one of the things we really try to do, we're a leadership advisory search firm at the executive level, right? So we're working with the C-suite. And the power of being able to have these conversations with the CEO and the C-suite leaders is hopefully behavioral changes and mindset shifts that happen at that senior leadership level have the scale that can go through the organization, right? So that's why we feel it's really powerful to try to give counsel to the C-suite on their individual journeys. So back to your question around like the power of the individual journey, frankly, the power of the individual journey for a C-suite leader can lead to some very impactful changes elsewhere in the organization. So that's one thing, is like trying to drive real leadership engagement in this topic, because what has sometimes happened in the past, some organizations have been at this, right, for decades and decades, and will sort of say, but why haven't things changed? Our numbers haven't changed. People are still telling us they're frustrated. What's the problem? Sometimes the challenge has been DEI has been an offshoot, a program, something held by HR, and the senior leadership team is supportive, but at arm's length. So the encouragement, which has been even more fruitful in the past year, the encouragement is C-suite leaders, you got to get in this, right? You've got to get in this conversation. It's not owned by other people on your team. You need to own this. And again, back to that personal journey piece. And one of the things we talk about in the personal journey, and I'll name to a couple concepts that Marc and Anthony have both touched on. We're always trying to meet people where they are, right? Anyone who's doing this DEI work is trying to meet people where they are, because you recognize if anybody gets shut down by being defensive or feeling ashamed of something they did or didn't do, they can't engage in the conversation anymore. So the opportunity is, how do you invite people into that individual learning journey, acknowledge some gaps maybe in their own behaviors without totally shutting them down? And one thing that we like to leverage in that is how we talk about inclusive leadership, which is at its like simplest, it comes very naturally to people to work easily with people with whom you share a lot, whether that's shared identity, shared history, shared attitude, shared motivation. When you are similar in those ways, and the deeper those similarities are, the easier it is. And what inclusive leadership is, it's a skill to build, is being able to work as seamlessly across differences. And when you think about it that way, and people can sort of sit themselves down, sort of reflect and say, have there been moments where I've really preferred to work with this person because they were similar to me? And I've been a little bit like, oh, I have to work with that person because they're totally different from me. People kind of get that, right? And then you can multiply that to what are all of those different elements of human difference that you might unconsciously be running from or not being as inclusive toward? How does that impact who you mentor and who you sponsor, for example, senior leader? And so, sort of stepping people through that understanding of how their leadership behaviors show up and how that very natural human tendency to run towards similarity and possibly shy away from difference can get people into a space where they're like, oh, I get it. I get it. And if we can do that again with C-suite leaders and they can start to model different behaviors, then they can model and exemplify and hold the rest of their leaders in the organization to the same standard. So that's the goal.
Thanks, Cynthia. I appreciate that. And so, Anthony, I know you and I have talked, and you mentioned in the beginning this piece about there's an internal component and then there's this external component. as the world is changing and you know, employee preferences are changing, consumer preferences are changing, and the demographics are shifting to create more and more of the dynamic that Cynthia was just describing. How is that impacting the considerations that you are thinking about in terms of your approach to DEI, either your personal approach as you lead through HR or the approach at Nike?
Yeah, so, you know, COVID has definitely unearthed for us new dimensions of how we all engage with ourselves, with our families. I've said that it has surfaced new dimensions of diversity, right? It's not just the employee who we had a certain camaraderie with before. It's someone who is struggling with the fact of I'm living across country from my family and I can't look at them to know if they're staying healthy. Or I've had to make some very strong decisions to move someone across country because I need to look at them because of where they are. I'm the lunch person, I'm teaching math, I'm analyzing spreadsheets, I'm showing up for meetings. Oh, by the way, I'm also stressed out because of civil and racial unrest, and I'm still angry and pained and all of these things. And so, you know, it's forcing us to really confront the new way of looking at the employee because everything about us has changed. And as we've been having the conversations about return to workplace, I'm like, there is a diversity element to this because there are some people who said, hey, I have proven to you that amidst being the lunch person, the parent, the employee, the caregiver, I've still nailed my job. And oh, by the way, I want to be in Fort Lauderdale now. I want to hang out in Chicago. I want to be in this place. And I think the tendency of an organization is, well, we kind of like to see you. And I totally appreciate the collaboration needs that we have to be in the same space. But I believe all of these things are causing us to have to really explore the new norm of our employee population. And I go back and I say it repeatedly, because we obsess the consumer, we have invested in what we call consumer insights. We can nail anybody on this call down to any subset of how we want to tell you a story about the new yoga pants that are coming out in spring, summer 23. We can do that extremely well. We know exactly how to find you through the channels. We know the stories that you need to hear, and we make it easily accessible for you to go to Nike.com and get them at the house right. So if we know how to do these things for our consumer, why are we seeming to be at the mercy of not being able to diagnose our employees the same way? And I do believe that these conversations probably aren't new. It's just because of COVID and where we are today, we have to double down. So ask for the investment on what does it look like to have an employee insights. And oh, by the way, that's just not your annual engagement survey. That's a once a year measurement. How are people showing up? Where are they along the curve? Some of my top performers may say, I don't need you to move me anymore. I've enjoyed this time with my kids. I don't need to be on the fast track anymore. We have to be able to bring those types of general business practices internal so that we're having the right conversations with our employees that are meaningful for them. Because we have to really acknowledge, like, everybody don't want to come in and have the hustle and bustle and grind of seeing you every day. And guess what? That's okay. And they shouldn't be penalized for that. Those are the types of things that we're obsessing as we have the conversations of how do we get people back to work? How do we get them back to work safely? And I'm asking the question, is that the right question? Should we be framing it in the most holistic way so that the insights of our employee population help us to make the right decisions to foster both productivity, but also it reinforces a culture of belonging?
Thanks, Anthony. I know our time, we're getting close on time. I want to ask Marc one question, then I'm going to do a round robin for everybody. But I know this has come up too, that how do we, as we take on these topics, we get these insights and we understand that there are certain populations of employees that we have, have unique needs for driving progress on equity. How do you think about all the focus that we've had more recently on race and how that applies to all dimensions of diversity? And how do we get to the level of complexity that Anthony was describing and make sure that we can have programmatic ways that actually are sufficient to deal with that complexity.
Yeah, look, conscious of the time, and that's a heady question, but I do want to dive in. I think it's a really important one. You know, I think it's a framing issue first off, Lynanne. I think that, you know, we need to look at my progress is not your setback, right? And like, because I deal with this, I dealt with this a lot as far as when there is like the dimension du jour, right? Like a particular dimension pops up and has press and has energy, has a conversation. Others will feel like, well, what about me? And this is not a whataboutism moment by any stretch. And I think these are genuine, you know, coming from a place of genuine concern. And I think what's really important is that we understand that, first off, if I made progress, we're not splitting the same pie smaller, we're expanding the pie, right? So my progress is your progress, first off. And then to your point, we're at different places across different dimensions. Well, if I think about like where the conversation on race has probably outpaced a conversation on gender in a moment. When we talk about gender, oftentimes we're talking about extension and further representation or promotion in organizations. And when we talk about race, we're talking about access in the first place, right? So typically, you know, the populations of women in their organizations somewhat mirrors like the census for the country, whereas for people of color, we're order of magnitudes off. So it's an extension and progress versus access. And we need to understand how to wrestle with those tensions. Now, the other part of your question is we need to make sure that we have platform processes, systems, and tools in place that benefit all. So for instance, if we de-bias our talent acquisition processes to where difference or diversity is uncovered and highlighted, that will lift all boats. If we de-bias our talent management and development processes, so stretch assignments for leadership training, for succession, we honor and value difference in those models versus dial it down, that will lift our boat. So there are going to be some platform systemic things we need to do, but also make sure we do some fine tuning for the differences for each dimension as we go along the journey and manage those two dynamics.
Thank you so much. This hour has gone so fast, and I know for me personally, I could listen to all three of you for, I don't know, a long time. So I'm sure that the participants are feeling that too. But as we close this out, I'm going to ask a round robin question. I'm going to ask each of you if you could give one piece of advice or encouragement to the participants on this call about one action they could take next to make forward progress, what would it be? Let's start, Cynthia, with you.
It's two words, but I know it's big. Bring empathy. Bring empathy.
Thank you. Marc.
I'll say, just from the ski industry perspective, I just want to say that I know that our infrastructure places us in communities that don't have a lot of racial diversity. So there's a lot of concern about how to go on this journey. Let me just say that what we're trying to do is value difference. And so when you think about the makeup of your organization, although it might be sort of monolithic, you have different backgrounds, experiences, you have different religions, you have all types of differences. Once we learn to value our difference for one, we can value the difference for all. And then as we continue to work on more inclusion ethically, we'll be prepared for that by the practice that we put in place.
Thank you. Anthony.
I would say build fellowship and be curious. One of the biggest things that I see is people expect you to, or people feel or impose on themselves expertise. Only thing I can be an expert at is my own experience. I don't know the best way to get anything about any one subset of our culture. So you can be curious, and that is the leading point. But when your curiosity is like, I don't know if I should ask that question, I feel like it could be awkward and go sideways. If you've built the fellowship and the person knows where you're coming from, you will get the grace of them telling you those things that you're curious about, if they don't feel like you're asking in condemnation and you're asking truly out of an empathetic, curious space.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Maggie, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you, Lynanne, Cynthia, Marc, Anthony. It was a pleasure listening to you all speak. I know I've definitely am leaving very inspired by this conversation. So thank you. And all of our attendees, thank you for spending the past hour with us. We have recorded the session and it'll be posted on snowsports.org by tomorrow. And we did have some great questions that were submitted, but as you can see, we had too much fun talking, so I didn't get to them all. But we are always planning more in future town halls and use those as a basis for our discussion. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Be well.